Good morning, thank you for joining us today for this webinar on a simple guide to asbestos on site. My name is Katie Di Stefano, I will be your moderator today, and any questions that you do have throughout this morning's event, there is the opportunity to ask questions using the question pane which is on the right hand side. Any questions that you do ask we will try and answer as we go along, plus we will also maybe respond to you individually after the event, just so we can actually reply to individual queries. We also have a hashtag running on Twitter, which is CABE-CPD. Your presenter this morning is Kevin Blunden. He's our Deputy Chief Executive on All Sides Technical, and he'll be providing the presentation. So I will now hand you over to Kevin.
Good morning and welcome to this webinar, which is intended to be a simple introduction to encountering asbestos on site, some information regarding what you can and can't do with asbestos, and hopefully to provide some practical examples of what it might look like to aid in identification when you do encounter it in your day-to-day life. Just to start with, to set the scene and for me to have a little bit of information about you, I'm going to ask a couple of quick questions of you via an online poll. So you will now be seeing a quick question on the screen, which I'd ask you to vote upon, and this is really in connection with how you're likely to encounter asbestos on site. This will sort of help me to get a feel for the sort of work you're involved with, potentially your role in, and get an idea of where to pitch this. Okay, so I've got roughly half of you have voted so far. And just a few more seconds now while the last votes come in. Okay, I think we're there. So to let you see the results of that, there is a fairly even split there between those of you who are surveying existing buildings and those of you visiting construction sites, with some other numbers dealing with refurbishment projects and demolition, which is fairly much what I'd expected to come across, and therefore it's a question of, rather than actually the majority of you being involved in day-to-day work with asbestos, it's potentially more of an issue of trying to get a handle on what it looks like when you encompass it, where it's likely to be, and therefore what the potential risks might be. So a quick follow-up question, and this one really is just to say, do you think you've possibly already been exposed to asbestos? So this is a simple yes, no, possibly type scenario. And again, we're voting fairly quickly on this one. Right, thank you. And again, to share the results with you there, 22% say yes, definitely, 67 possibly, and 12% maybe not. So clearly there's a majority who may have or have been exposed to asbestos, and I think that's probably what we would expect in the industry, given that asbestos was still being used quite regularly up until 2000 as a new build solution. One of the key issues with asbestos is it is sometimes quite difficult to identify. The way in which we refer to asbestos can be confusing. Quite often we refer to it by colour, but that does not reflect how it's going to look when you encounter it in the building. It refers to the raw mineral state of the product, and therefore you can't necessarily tell if a product is asbestos, or if you are fairly sure it is asbestos, what type of asbestos it is, simply by looking at it. So normally in most of our buildings, asbestos has been mixed in with something else. For example, the board and insulation coating. It can often look very similar to other materials. Since asbestos was being phased out and other alternative products were being brought in, it can be very difficult to know the difference between the alternative replacement and the original asbestos, and particularly then when the time of installation would allow for work still to have been using asbestos, or on the cusp of when we moved away from it. So anything built in the sort of 1980s, 1990s, it would be difficult to know for sure whether it's an asbestos product or something that's replaced it later. Realistically, what you have to say to yourself is if you're working on a building that was built before the year 2000, there is a fairly high likelihood that it will include some asbestos within the building. Just getting the slides to move forward. So some of the risks to health that we will find in terms of asbestos, they are majority of the time very serious in their consequence. Part of the problem with the illnesses that can occur as a result of exposure is that they do not necessarily show themselves immediately. It can be several years later that something becomes apparent, but once it becomes apparent, quite often we cannot no longer take preventative measures. We've got to then start thinking about maybe we need to move on and deal with treatment if possible, but quite often it can be incredibly serious and can lead to fatalities. So the exposure can lead to a number of conditions which can be in the early stages difficult to diagnose, and obviously it can be tricky to identify that it was the asbestos exposure that led to the condition as well. So from a regulatory point of view, a legislation point of view, we do have control asbestos regulations, and it is worth noting that although the regulations are 2012 regulations, some changes as a effect of the regulations only come into force this year in terms of dealing with non-notifiable work, monitoring of health and those sorts of issues. But in general terms, there are some duties that apply across the board in terms of dealing with asbestos. We have a duty to determine if there are materials containing asbestos in non-domestic premises. Unless there's strong evidence to show that it's not there, there's a sort of a base assumption that asbestos probably is present. If you are in charge of a property or advising a client, they need to keep an up-to-date record of the location and condition of asbestos. And this is partly because, to a certain extent, the materials that contain asbestos within the building may not in themselves present a risk unless they are damaged or altered or moved. And quite often it can be the case that it's there and in good condition. It just needs to be notified and kept on a register so that we know that if we do any work in that area, we have a potential issue. It is also important as employers, and particularly when we're sending people into survey buildings, that we look at the risk to those individuals from the exposure to asbestos. We need to be aware that some of the simple precautions that we would take on normal sites, such as a straightforward face dust mask, may not actually be sufficient in terms of asbestos particles. And therefore we have to look at doing a risk assessment based on what's there to protect individuals going into a circumstance. And as far as possible, the assumption is that if we don't know, then we assume there's a problem. So we have to have a plan in place to deal with the project, to mitigate the risk, to ensure we protect the health and safety of those having to deal with it. Once we have a plan in place, then we need to periodically review that and make sure it's kept up to date. So that anybody working in the premises has an idea of where the materials are and what steps have to be taken if they need to move forward. Right, I'm just going to, at this stage, check with Katie. There appear to be a couple of issues with seeing the presentation, Katie. Can you confirm that that's okay to be now resolved itself?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine, Kevin. Yeah, it's coming through okay. I've got a few people that have got issues with sound, so apologies if there's a few sound issues, if you can actually hear me saying that. But as far as I can see, the system is working okay. So.
Okay. We have already had 2 or 3 questions come in, predominantly about leaving materials in place if they are in good condition, or regarding the extent of the work that can be done without having to be done by a licensed contractor. I'll get onto that as we go through the presentation. There's also a question just popped in about whether there are some pro formas for asbestos risk registers. There is an awful lot of guidance on the Health and Safety Executive website to detail how these sorts of things can be done, what can be done in terms of full asbestos survey. It really relates to the extent of the premises in terms of how extensive it may be, and whether an expert has to come in and give advice, or whether, given the likely occurrence of asbestos, a knowledgeable surveyor would be able to do the risk survey. It really depends on identifying the key areas where asbestos may occur, which is what we'll talk about now. And then, yes, there is some information on the Health and Safety Executive website on that, on what to do and how to go about doing it. So one of the key issues with asbestos is that it was still being used up until relatively recently, 15 years ago now, but for an awful long while before 2000, the industry was aware there was an issue with asbestos products and an implication for long-term health. And it is a fairly frequently used material. It's quite often used in things such as pipe lagging, profiled sheeting, guttering downpipes, ceiling tiles, soffit fascias. And these are some of the areas where sometimes it can be difficult to establish whether it's a asbestos product or not. So many buildings that were being constructed or refurbished up until 2000 still contained asbestos products. An awful lot of existing buildings still have asbestos there, and there is the potential then for that asbestos to release fibres into the air if it is disturbed, if it's damaged in any way, if somebody drills into it to fix something else. There is a potential that those asbestos fibres will then get into the air. So yes, the first word of warning is it will still be there in the vast majority of buildings we're encountering today. Where are we actually likely to find the asbestos products? Well, an awful lot of asbestos cement products were used in finishes. Textured coatings, particularly things like Artex ceilings, included asbestos products. Some floor tiles, some fire-resistant textiles, some composite materials would have included asbestos in their makeup, as would some sprayed coatings on ceilings, some pipe insulation, which, as we've said, and some loose asbestos insulation in ceiling and floor cavities. And particularly in relation to this, it can be difficult to know just on inspection whether it is an asbestos-based insulation material or whether it's something that was in favour in sort of the 60s and 70s, which was sort of recycled paper mixed in with fibre as an insulating material. So it can be very difficult to identify. The only absolutely sure way to do that is possibly to send the material off for testing, but the issue really is once you encounter anything that you believe may be asbestos during the inspection, it needs to be flagged up and highlighted. Now that can be tricky because if it is something like a floor tile and the floor tiles are not damaged, there's no particular risk. You don't necessarily want to raise a red flag with the client if you're not absolutely sure, but if there is a possibility, it's better to err on the side of caution, because obviously should somebody then decide to lift those floor tiles and damage them in the process, there is the potential for fibres to be released into the atmosphere. So I said at the beginning that asbestos is broadly dealt with and categorised by the colour, and that is relating to the actual mineral itself. There are some issues in terms of which tend to be used most commonly for which types of materials. So amosite, which is commonly known as brown asbestos, is frequently the cement profiled sheeting, the pipe insulation, insulating boards, ceiling tiles, thermal insulation products. That tends to have needle-like fibres, but again some of these fibres can be incredibly small and not necessarily possible to see by the naked eye. White asbestos, if you like, tends to be found in roofs, ceilings. Also that would be the sort of asbestos that would have been used in the brakes in cars, those sorts of things. But obviously, as far as the construction is concerned, things like gaskets, seals would also potentially have been involving white asbestos or grey asbestos, and they're theoretically exposure to this does mean that we get a range of related diseases. And then blue asbestos is the one that predominantly would be used for fire-resisting products. It's quite often considered to be the most dangerous type of asbestos, but that to a certain extent is partly down to the mineral, but partly down to the way in which it's used in terms of sprayed-on coatings, pipe insulation, cement products, which tend to be more friable, which tend to have more particles released into the atmosphere during their initial application and then when work is done to deal with it, and that therefore can lead to a greater risk of exposure. In terms of some of the products that we'd like to see, there are a few slides here to give you some photographic ideas. Again, most of this information comes via the Health and Safety Executive, who have a whole load of information and guidance on their website. Generally, if the material is held within a structure, then there's only an issue if the tiles get broken. You can quite often have situations where people have identified asbestos within the premises, and that asbestos has been sealed to ensure that no fibres then can come off it. This is quite often the case if you've had an old boiler that may have had an asbestos flue. The boiler's been removed, but somebody doesn't want to take the flue out throughout the property, so it will be effectively sealed and the actual material coated and sealed to prevent fibres being given off. Early in my career, I did deal with a very old theatre that had a large auditorium with asbestos ceiling tiles. They'd been identified as a potential risk. There was an annual inspection to make sure they were intact, but in the meantime they had been treated and sealed with a sealant so that no fibres could escape. The difficulty then comes if accidental damage occurs, or if somebody has to cut or drill into these materials, and that's when we can get issues with fibres being released and precautions have to be taken. There's also an acknowledged risk now with some textured coating materials such as Artex, where the fibres were incorporated within the textured coating. Now this tends to be a fashionable issue. You know, we originally had a lot of properties with very flat ceilings and decorative covings and cornices. Then again, predominantly through the late 60s, 70s, there was a trend to go for textured surfaces. Obviously more recently we have textured surfaces that do not have the asbestos content, but when we're dealing with existing properties it can be difficult to know what exactly we're encountering. Okay, right, Katie, have we got any further questions that have come in?
Not questions as such. I'm just picking up something from Graham regarding, I'm just reading this now, saying about asbestos surveyors often including caveats in reports which would exclude the investigation of materials at height and within electrical fittings and heating plants.
Yes, I think there is a general tendency that if somebody is carrying out a property survey for a client and something isn't accessible or it's not appropriate to be looking to get elements tested, then some form of caveat or disclaimer to explain the restrictions of the survey and to highlight the potential risks of materials that can't necessarily be identified in detail makes very good sense, because obviously short of actually taking samples and sending them away for testing, it can sometimes be very difficult to ascertain what a material is, and again that's not necessarily always appropriate, particularly if it is something like a high ceiling or something that's out of the way. So yes, it would make sense wherever there is a potential for all the client to be made aware of that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So some other examples of where we might find asbestos that perhaps we wouldn't look for, things like fire blankets, textiles treated for fire resistance historically would have potentially contained asbestos. Realistically now, a lot of these things have a limited life and probably would have been replaced through the life of the building, but you can never be sure in some older premises. The floor tiles, which can quite often at first glance just look like a traditional vinyl floor tile, it can be very difficult to ascertain what's there. The nature of the tile tends to mean that it tends to be sealed and not much is going to happen to it. So really the risk only occurs when somebody actually starts moving or removing those tiles. And then some older fuses and fuse boxes and panels would have contained some asbestos within them. So again, other common instances of where we may come across it.
Kevin, can I just possibly ask a quick question? Just going back to your textured coatings and ceilings and what have you, just had a quick question come in. I just think it's appropriate to ask it now. How dangerous would it be, for example, if you wanted to put in an extra light fitting to create a hole in an Artex ceiling? What would the risk be there?
Yes, I mean, obviously with anything that contains asbestos there is always a risk in carrying out work. If you're looking at something like a simple 75, 100mm core drill into a ceiling that may or may not contain asbestos, the main issues there are to take the appropriate precautions when you're doing the work to ensure that you're protected from breathing in any fibres that may occur, to try and do the best possible to capture fibres as they're produced by the process. But as we'll see as we go through, there are some works that are short duration, minor in nature, that don't have to be done through a controlled licensed arrangement. That I suppose the difficulty is if they were being done by a contractor, we would have to risk assess the situation. The contractor would have to have the appropriate protective equipment. We'd have to have a method statement of how we're going to do it. But these are also the sort of works that people are going to undertake on a do-it-yourself basis with no clear indication of the potential risks that are there. And a lot of it, particularly when it comes down to how we control work on asbestos, does come down to how extensive the work is and the duration of the work. So if this work was being done in a well-ventilated area, if the drilling was linked to a vacuum cleaner device and appropriate masks were being worn, then the risks are fairly low. So yes, small little areas such as just cutting in, that would not require any form of notification. It is a short duration work, and therefore as long as you're sensible, that shouldn't be a major problem. That said, if you were cutting in, you know, dozens and dozens of light fittings into an old ceiling, that would be a different situation.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Just seeing a lot of comments now coming in about ceilings. So perhaps we'll move on, then we can.
Yes, yes. And I think there's another one I'd pick up on there, is that not all Artex finishes of the 1780s contained asbestos. It is true, because obviously Artex ceilings, it's a bit like talking about hoovers as opposed to vacuum cleaners. There were and are a range of makeup textured finishes. Some would have contained, some wouldn't. The tricky bit is actually identifying and knowing what material is within the ceiling. So yes, it's one of those things that you cannot necessarily see just by looking at the material. Therefore, if the safest assumption is if it was put in before we were aware of the issues, so certainly before 2000, but realistically before, probably a decade before that, then I would tend to assume the worst and plan for the worst, even though there may not be asbestos actually in the product.
Lovely, thank you.
One of the key areas that asbestos tends to be used in terms of its fire performance is on things like sprayed applied finishes to steelwork and the like. The problem with the sprayed applied finishes, even minor disturbance can see fairly large quantities of fibres being released into the atmosphere. So again, you'd have to take a sensible view as to what we're doing, but if you were looking to cut into this sort of material, then that's going to potentially cause an issue. The other problem, of course, is being a sprayed finish, it tends to end up with a very heavily textured final finish, and therefore it's not something that can easily be retro-treated to seal, and therefore it's one of those things that you have to take a view on whether we just put measures in place to ensure it's not disturbed, but at the same time do we actually look to make sure that we try and maybe look at getting a specialist contractor in to remove and replace with something that isn't so much of an issue. It really depends on the likelihood of exposure. Insulating boards, ceiling tiles and the like, again, if the tiles are intact, if the boards are intact, not too much of an issue. And again, these are the sort of things that can be fairly easily sealed, but again can be quite difficult to identify which material is actually in use, and it tends to be, as with most of the issues we're talking about, if you know it's of a certain age, it's probably best to assume that there's a potential for risk. Pipe lagging tends to be one of the areas, and particularly the first slide on the screen there, which sort of shows the wrapping material coming adrift. These tend to be the things that were put in because of their heat resisting properties, tend to be subject to bumps and scrapes, tend to be subject to damage where materials can be knocked loose. These are clearly elements that would have to be identified in a risk register, asbestos register for a premises, for those in control of a premise, and the normal situation here would be to either look at totally encapsulating the material, or more frequently to get a specialist contractor in to deal with the removal. There are a couple more questions popping in, I notice. There's one to say, do notice plates have to be put in place in relation to where asbestos is, or just a register? In reality, it is an onus on the people in charge of the premises and surveyors advising them. Realistically, the risk register, the asbestos register, would identify the locations. You would then potentially come up with permits to work for those areas, conditions to work in those areas. As a belt and braces approach, I would suggest that it's a good idea to put notices in place, but realistically nobody should be working and operating in those areas without being aware that there's a potential issue. Somebody said, do loose grid ceiling tiles contain asbestos? The answer is possibly. It depends on the age of the tile and the makeup of it. So again, if they're of an age and you're unsure, then realistically you have to consider that it's a possibility. Another question that's popped in, if somebody's been exposed, how likely is it to damage their health? Are we somewhat immune? I think the issue with that is it's incredibly difficult to say in terms of exposure. Are we somewhat immune? Not really. In theory, one of the problems is if you visited the site immediately aware that you become exposed, actually seeking medical advice at that point, it won't necessarily be possible to diagnose whether that's going to cause you a long-term effect or not. And then questions in terms of if somebody's taken down an Artex ceiling which may or may not have had asbestos, what should be the advice there in terms of cleanup? So if somebody's already removed asbestos, really the advice in terms of cleaning, if the product's already been removed, is that there is a thorough clean so that there's no possible particles left lying around anywhere. A couple of other examples of where we may use or may encounter asbestos. Loose fill insulation. Now obviously loose fill insulation is a very high risk because of its very loose nature. The potential to introduce fibres into the air is quite high. There are issues where people then start to bring these sort of roofs into additional use, as in living accommodation, or where additional insulation is provided on as well, or if somebody's encountered a roof that's got loose fill insulation that subsequently suffers condensation and somebody puts ventilation into the roof. Any of this sort of disturbance is going to cause an issue. It's an issue for the client particularly, because if they start using that void on a regular basis, there are problems. They also need to look at how things like the sealing around the loft hatch works to stop the particles migrating down into the property. I would suggest if anybody comes across loose fill insulation that they believe has asbestos, then you are looking really at a solution of removal, a thorough cleaning, and putting in an alternative material. So I'm going to ask a third question at this point. And the question is really, do you, as an individual or your surveyor, have in place a risk assessment in terms of dealing with asbestos and how individuals are protected? So the votes rolling in there. We've got about just less than half of you voted now. Okay, give it just a few more seconds to get everybody in and voted. Fine, I think that's round about it. I'm going to close the vote now, just waiting for one more person. That's it, okay. Okay, and to let you see those results, I suppose realistically from my point of view that's quite a worrying situation, in that there's a very large number of you who either don't believe there's any sort of risk assessment or process in place, or you're unsure about that. And clearly, if you are going to premises, surveying premises for a client, carrying out a role for an employer, there should be some provisions in place. As at the very least, if we can't look at the risk and we can't mitigate the risk in any other way, we should ensure that people are kitted out with the white bit of equipment. And as I say, you have to be very careful. Some of the normal sort of dust masks that we wouldn't use won't necessarily deal with the particle sizes, so we have to be to make sure we're clear in what we're looking at. But the best advice, to be perfectly honest, is if you are unsure and it looks as if there may be loose particles around and about, then take a step back. Don't proceed with what you're trying to do. Get expert advice is really what we'd be suggesting. So the people in charge of the maintenance and repair of workplaces have a legal duty to provide anybody who's likely to disturb asbestos products with information about the location and the condition of the asbestos before the work starts, so that that person can then take into account precautions that need to be made. And that's normal. That's the basis of our asbestos register. And if you are in charge of a commercial premises, you may simply find that, you know, contractors, before they're called to site, particularly heating engineers, may ask for a copy of that, so that they know whether the flues and things they're likely to encounter are actually likely to be going to cause the employee who's actually doing maybe the maintenance or the service of the boiler an issue. Ideally, then, the information about the asbestos should be available when contractors are going through the tendering process for a project that may involve work on asbestos, and that's the ideal situation. It can be planned for. If needs be, licensed subcontractors can be brought in to deal with that element of the work. The difficult bit will be that in reality, quite often the asbestos isn't identified until we start taking the building to pieces, and then we become aware. And to a certain extent, that may well mean that we just hit the point where the work stops on site until we've managed to deal with that asbestos risk. So clearly, if you're not in control of the site yourself, but you are visiting the site and you become aware, or you think there may be asbestos on the site, then that needs to be reported back to those in control of the project. So when are you actually the most likely to be at risk? Well, as with any risk to health and safety, one of the key times when you're likely to be at risk is when you enter onto an unfamiliar site. And many of you from where we established at the beginning of this webinar, you're visiting premises on the basis of carrying out a survey to an existing premises. You're visiting a construction site in progress on a refurbishment project. You're not going to be necessarily familiar with the site, so therefore it is absolutely critical that on attending and starting to deal with the project, that you make contact with the person in control of the project on site, the site manager, the client, whoever, and establish where the risks are and if anybody is aware of the risk. As I've said, mainly we're talking about risks on buildings that were done and built before 2000. The biggest risk is where we encounter the asbestos as the work goes along, and where it wasn't known about by the people who don't necessarily understand what's within their building. One of the other problems is that we do tend to regulate the industry in terms of the extent that the work that can be done without going through a formal licensed notification process, and it tends to be that low level work when you're likely to be exposed, and obviously depending on the extent of that exposure, the frequency, the duration, that can potentially present you with a risk. So there are a couple of other questions that have come in. So realistically, I think there's one there about if you're self-employed and you have no employees, would you still need to carry out a written risk assessment? I think, to be honest, the issue would be that any individual visiting a site should assess the risks from their own point of view. Whether that needs to be written or not, if you're an individual sole trader, professional, then possibly not, as long as you can demonstrate you've considered the risks. Obviously, one of the main issues we find in this sort of litigation-driven environment that we are now is that should you go onto a site, should you be exposed, should some subsequent claim be made either by yourself or a party on your behalf or whatever, you need to be able to demonstrate that you've done everything to look after yourself and not necessarily rely solely on others. So as an individual, you would have to do an assessment yourself, make sure you've got the right equipment, but as I said earlier, the most straightforward approach is as soon as you become aware that there's an issue that may lead you to being exposed, the best option at that point is to take a step back and get it dealt with by a specialist contractor. So we have a general situation that materials can be released into the atmosphere. They can cause us a long-term project. By the time you're actually, a long-term issue in terms of health, by the time you're diagnosed, it's quite often too late to do anything about it. So you do sort of have to think about what you're doing and plan it. If you are dealing with asbestos awareness or anybody who may come across asbestos, there is a responsibility to ensure that those people have had a level of asbestos awareness training. Now, as I've said, there is an element of being able to do some non-licensed work, particularly on cement sheets, textured coatings, if the work is of short duration, and generally short duration is taken as being something that's going to last for less than an hour if it's being done by one person, or maybe less than 2 hours if it's a couple of people, but that shouldn't be repeated again within a 7-day period. So it is quite restrictive, but it does allow for the sort of scenario we were talking about earlier on with cutting in a light fitting or something of that sort. But again, even though it's non-licensed, people doing the work, if they're being employed to carry out this task, other than maybe on a DIY basis, they do need to have sufficient training and awareness of the potential issues and the right equipment to do this. So when you're looking at drilling holes, replacing light fittings that are fitted to asbestos tiles, taking up floor tiles, cleaning, guttering, all of those things, although they could potentially be done outside the licensed framework, would realistically require the contractor still to be aware, to carry out awareness training, to provide the protective equipment, and to make sure that there's a method statement to address how the work's going to be done. Most of the higher level work in terms of removing sprayed coatings, cleaning up vast quantities of dust, working on any of boards or anything like where it's not going to meet those short duration requirements, working on pipe ladding, loose fill insulation. This is all higher risk work that needs to be done by a licensed contractor. Okay, that was a brief run through the situation. The one thing I would add to that is some of the changes that happened this year in terms of the regulatory approach relate to the non-licensed side of work. If you have contractors doing out that, there are additional requirements in terms of health monitoring that can come and working with that now. Right, I'm just now looking to see if we've got any further questions that have come in that we haven't maybe touched on. Have you got anything there, Katie?
We've touched on most of it. It's still rolling around about ceiling tiles, and I think what we'll perhaps do in that instance is we'll sit together, Kevin, and compile sort of a generalisation of response in terms of
yes.
the architecture tiles.
What we can do, and we will do following this webinar, is the webinar will be posted online. We will post the frequently asked questions and the responses to those. But I would very much encourage anybody viewing the webinar today who wants more information, maybe a bit more detail, to visit the Health and Safety Executive website. There is a large amount of free to download information on that site which guides on this particular subject. It is seen as one of the big issues within the industry. I think part of the concern that some of the industry have at the moment is we have a good knowledge of asbestos now. We know what the risks are. We've addressed it. The concern is always what's the next material that we've been using for several years that nobody has really appreciated the risk of yet, that there's potentially a long-term effect of that we're just not available. We're not aware of at this moment in time. So there's always the potential of what's the next asbestos, if you like. I'm just picking up a couple of other bits and pieces in terms of briefly for unlicensed works. What are the arrangements with disposal? This does tend to vary depending on where you are around the country. Generally, it has to be a licensed area that materials are disposed to. Having said that, a lot of local authorities do have arrangements in place for DIY type basis, individual householders to dispose of asbestos. But again, the issues are concerned about what type of asbestos it is, whether it's likely to lead to an issue.
Have you seen the comment that's just come in from Russell, Kevin, regarding clearance certificates when it's stated that the area is clear, but they've gone back in to find that it's actually not?
No, I mean, I think as with anything, if you've had a contractor in, they've cleaned the building of any residual fibres, and they've certified that, and clearly cleaning the fibres would be done by a licensed contractor. If you then revisit the building and find that that's not the case, then it's back to square one. Take a step back, and somebody else has got to go in and make sure that job is done effectively. Okay, is there any comments about other fibre containing materials, loft insulation, etc.? That's the sort of thing I was referring to in terms of eventual risks going forward. There is concern in the industry at the moment about some loft insulation fibres. There is a lot of concern about general dust on construction sites, and I think at the moment those are probably subjects of maybe future webinars, but it is something to be aware of. And again, asbestos is one of several risks that we really ought to consider when we're putting people or putting ourselves onto sites where we may encounter these things. Okay. So yes, there's a few issues there around what the new materials might be. There are also sort of a few housekeeping issues, Katie, in terms of the presentation, CPD, and the like. So if it's okay, I think any other technical questions that come in, we will pick up via the frequently asked questions element on our website. Otherwise, I'll hand back to you now, Katie, and you can perhaps wrap up the webinar.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. I want to say thank you to Kevin for his time this morning to produce and present to you. Again, thank you all for actually attending. In terms of, as Kevin's commented about the housekeeping and what have you, this webinar has been recorded and will be available online hopefully very shortly. It'll be on our YouTube and Vimeo channels. Links will be available via the website. Also, in terms of actually the CPD for the event, the CPD, you can, if any CABE members can log into the website to their account and actually register 1 hour CPD for today's session. Our next webinar will be on the 17th of June, and that's going to be looking at dangerous buildings. So if you wish to attend, you can register via our website, or you can book through the link that you'll get in the email after this event. So again, we'd like to thank you very much for joining us. Hope you found this morning worthwhile and interesting, and we'll see you online again soon. Thanks very much.